Hi there, and welcome back to another episode at Station Road, and of course the first episode for 2025. So I'd just like to say a very happy new year to all my viewers. So in today's episode we're continuing on where we left off in the last episode, of course, which was where we raised the ground level around the station area. And of course in today's episode we're continuing on where the areas of the previous ground level need adjusting, and that's the overhead bridge and of course where the factory is with the cobblestone forecourt. So there was some great feedback and comments from the previous episode, and also some interesting suggestions about dealing with the space around the station on the station road layout, because as you all know I'm limited to what I can actually do there. So in today's episode, or at least in the second part of this episode, I'm actually going to investigate that a little bit more. But first things first, we're just going to dive into the overhead bridge and also the factory area and actually work out what to do there in terms of making sure that they align with this new raised level of groundwork. So I think without further ado, let's just jump into what I got up to. So with the new area raised up with the platform and the station and the pub and this demolished building site, of course the next component really to address was the overhead bridge, which was now out of alignment with the ground level. And as I mentioned in the previous episode, I hedged my bets on being able to modify the existing bridge rather than having to completely rebuild it, because the interesting thing is that this whole cutting through here, and of course there's a murder scene down there where they've found a body buried in the ballast, and there's loads of fly tipping, couches, old lawnmowers and things like that down in the cutting. And I actually built that many years ago as a separate unit, but it's not a lift out unit, but I found it easier to be able to build it off the layout and then situate it in there. And so the whole area, including where the church is on the hill, that's a lift out section. This area became a modular component. So, and of course the bridge was lined up and constructed on the angle that it needed to be to get from the road passing around the church down to the original ground level where the station was. And the line that's actually in there, well, there's a double track line in there, but one of the lines in there I modelled that as disused and very rusty and old. The other one is actually functional, and it is actually a working loop that runs completely through under the layout and in behind. And I'll just throw up a quick track plan so you know where we are and you can actually see where it is. Now, I haven't actually run trains on it for ages, but it is a connected loop and it does actually work. So it's part of the original layout, it's part of the original mainline track once upon a time, before this layout of mine kind of morphed into at least twice its original size. So hence the line in there, and at some point I'd love to get trains running through there again, because it does actually make for a good running session with trains running through that cutting. So obviously after mutilating the parapets or the top section of the bridge, it was a case of having to cut back the actual original road bed so that I could layer a new level of the road over the top. But of course I had to cut that back enough, the original one, in order for it to create the new gradient or new alignment. And the interesting thing is that in doing so and getting it lined up with the new ground level, which is, as we know, around the station, the pub and all of that kind of thing, is the new parapets actually line up better anyway, so it's all quite peculiar in some ways. I sort of felt like maybe a couple of years ago when I originally designed this, maybe I had some kind of sixth sense or insight into this, because it's actually all worked out really well, because even the parapets on the sides of this cutting where the arches are, they actually line up now with the road a lot better. They're nowhere near as high, and it's really quite unusual how it's all worked out. So I've done a little bit of tidying up work, obviously, where the corners meet, and I've still got more work to do in it. There's still extra layers of some brickwork that I'm going to use in those areas to tidy up the ends and the corners, and have the sort of the end block units with the capping stones on top and things like that. Now, the brickwork that I've actually used in this, of course, is not the printed stuff that I use. It's Metcalfe brick texture. And the interesting thing is I actually managed to dig out some brick texture that I'd already pre-weathered to a certain degree, and of course it had a matte spray varnish on it, over it. So all I needed to do was just dull it down and weather it down a little bit more. And the fascinating thing is it kind of looks like it's always been that way, so it's quite interesting. I'm going to add a few more weeds back in there and a bit of overgrowth, because there was some on the original bridge. So the original parapet walls, of course, were just 3mm MDF, and I've used further 3mm MDF, and in order to get the angle right, so the brick course actually runs to the angle. So I've seen that most commonly, that the bricks end up, or the brick courses do end up on a slant. So by slotting in a sheet of card and actually just marking out the new angle of the bridge, that helped me to determine the angle for the course of the bricks, and of course the slant or the angle, the elevation for the actual parapet walls. So of course the brickwork was just layered up either side of this 3mm MDF, and then of course on the outer side of the bridge the brick course went a lot deeper, but it had to go deep enough to cover up the original brickwork that ran down the side of the bridge. So the capping stones on top of the parapet, once again, they're just some leftover Metcalfe capping stones that I had from, I think, Viaduct kit or something like that. And incidentally, the arch retaining walls within this whole cutting, they are actually a Metcalfe Viaduct kit that I've kit bashed to turn into retaining walls rather than it actually being a viaduct. So the next step we'll cross over to is actually working out how we're going to have the road go down to where this factory area is and where the cobblestones are. Now, it's not too much of a difference in height between the two levels, so I think I can fashion a sloping area there, possibly made out of some high density foam that I can just carve to the correct gradient or slope and sort of work it down into that cobblestone area. So I've fashioned up a bit of sloping landform which is going to go in here, and this is just made from some high density foam, and of course this is going to enable the factory level here to rise up to the road level. It saves me having to raise all of this up, and basically I just sort of trace the shape in here. There's a little piece of MDF here because there was always this chunk missing out of here, so what I'm actually going to do is glue this section onto this component, so this is always still going to remain as a lift out section. Then once that's glued in, then I can sort of carry on and actually just sort of bleed out the remainder of this landform down with possibly a little bit of sculptor mold or some kind of putty or something like that to bring it down, and even maybe include sort of tile tread marks in there as it comes down. So we're just going to glue this on here and then let that set, and then once I've done that we'll put this back onto the layout and we can take a look and see how it's working. Right, so I've now got the factory back in place with the cobblestone forecourt and so forth, and now of course with this sloping bit of landform, which of course is the, as I mentioned, the high density foam that we've just glued on there, and I think it's going to work. So this is definitely suitable enough for a base foundation for this rising bit of landform. So once we've treated it with tarmac or some other type of material that will be applied over that, and that whatever that material is, that will sort of bleed into the cobblestone and kind of merge through. So it gives the impression maybe that you often saw that in sort of factory yards and forecourts, that there were different materials in different areas and bits were repaired with concrete and other forms of tarmac and so forth. So I think that's going to work reasonably well. And the slope isn't too bad. I think it's pretty convincing, like it's not overly steep or anything like that, and I think that's going to work. And of course it still finishes just before, of course, that raised dock area, so obviously with trucks rolling in here they can still reverse in, or they can actually drive in through this way and down into this area here, and I think it's going to work. It's reasonably plausible, I think. So job done for that. Of course, as I mentioned, we'll be coming back to that at a later stage with further scenic treatments. So now that we've got the overhead bridge sorted out, so that it now lines up with the new ground level, of course, around the station and so forth, I thought I would go back to now the station area and take a closer look at the space available and return to the discussion I had in the previous episode, which is about where the station building should be positioned on the platform, and some of the room or space around the rear of the station where the street is and things like that. So there was a reasonable amount of feedback in the previous episode about where the station building should be positioned, and I think it's sort of fair to say, and also really sort of my own personal preference, that I will have the station down towards the wider end of the street, and I sort of like the idea of it sort of lining up with this perpendicular street that comes in. So although you don't see it because the edge of the baseboard of course chops everything off, but if you could imagine that intersection, there would be a T intersection in the street and there would be another street coming in, and that's directly opposite the entrance into the station. So another aspect that of course needs a little bit of research, and this is more to do with Laura and Gil's model, less to do with the model I'm building for the station road layout, and that is what's going on around the station in terms of the track and the sidings and other small components, buildings, any other infrastructure that's around the station. Because as we know, what I'm going to be doing is building a model for Laura and Gil, but it's going to include an area of the station, the two tracks, the second platform, and just a small amount of area around the station. So one of the things that I need to do was dig out some maps of the station as it used to be, and hopefully reveal some of the track configurations as well. Now, one of the other interesting things too that this will actually benefit is there were a few people commented on the previous episode saying, well, why don't you just get rid of the pub, get rid of the demolition construction site, and actually model more of the station area as it was before the lines closed. So actually include some of the infrastructure and so forth that was actually around the real station prior to obviously it closing. Now, one of the things that is a little bit tricky to do within the railway modelling community is to build railway models that literally are to scale and mimic the same size as their real live counterparts. So that includes landscape and infrastructure and all that kind of thing. Generally, in most situations, a railway model will be condensed or reduced in size in order to fit certain things in. So you've been staring at this map that I've had up on the screen and you're wondering, well, what's this all about? And I certainly can't see any railway lines running through this area. Now, this is a map from 1879, and it's showing the landscape and the geography prior to this railway line ever existing. So there's some small country roads and farm tracks. We've got some wooded areas and so forth, and this is not far out of Cardiff in southwest Wales, so it's very rural, and in a lot of ways there's no sort of sign of urban development or anything like that whatsoever. Now, if we just slowly transition ahead a little bit further in time, and this map here is from 1898, so just before the turn of the century, and voila, we have a railway here, and this of course is the Brewery Railway, and of course we can see what's indicated as Wenvo Station. Now, I decided not removing the name. Now, I try to not push the name too much, just simply out of privacy for Lure and Gill. The last thing I'd want was a bunch of people turning up at their property with cameras and so forth and being curious as to their renovation. So it's the Wenvo Station, and it's on the old Brewery Railway. Now, straight away, interestingly, you can see most of the geography around this area hasn't really changed. It's still the same. We've got a small country roads, we've got a farm tracks and wooded areas and so forth. But of course, the one thing we can see is this railway line has carved its way smack through the landscape. So one of the things that we can note here is the track work, and we've got a double track main line, and then we've got a branch line heading off that's just to the right of the double tracks, and then we've got a smattering of sidings and crossovers. Now, the branch line that heads off just to the right of the main lines, that goes to a quarry, and it actually runs up the embankment behind platform 2, heads over unbelievably a level crossing. So we have a road that goes over the railway via an overhead bridge, and they're immediately greeted by a level crossing. So it's quite an unusual scenario. Next to that, there is a small siding which seems to stop just before the road, and then on the left side of the station, so on the platform 1 with the main station building, we've got a small siding that heads up and stops just before the main station building, and then we've got 2 other sidings that head out on a slight angle, and they actually go to a livestock pen or cattle docks, and they'll be indicated in a following map. So if I just transition out and highlight the track in red, you can actually see more clearly what's going on. So as I said, there's this branch line that heads off to a quarry, goes up would have been actually a reasonably steep incline on the right hand side of the platform 2, up over a level crossing, and then up actually on the top of the embankment where the mainline cutting is. So that would have carried on up that way. It had a small siding as well that stopped before the road. Then on, of course, the other side, we've got a small siding that comes up to just before the main station building, and then of course we've got these 2 sidings which are for a cattle dock and livestock pens. So if we transition through once again, and now we've travelled through into 1947, and of course the railway line's still there. It's still being used, although I suspect at this point its traffic is probably quite severely reduced, because one of the key differences to note here is that the siding or branch line that went to the quarry has now been cut off. And although it does in this map indicate that it extends just beyond the road, so the level crossing's still there, the rest of it has been lifted up. So at some point that quarry stopped producing material to be transported by rail, and so that would have probably been a significant loss to the railway in terms of income, and particularly for the station as well. So the small siding that came off that branch line that stopped just before the road has been removed, but then there's another siding that appears to have been added that just stops before the end of platform 2. On the other side of the mainline tracks, of course, we've still got our siding that approaches towards the main station building, and then of course we've still got the 2 sidings that lead to livestock pen or the cattle dock. So obviously maybe that is still in use in 1947. So once again, highlighting the actual track work itself, we can see the branch line to the quarry is chopped off. It still just proceeds past the road there, and then of course there is a small siding tucked in there that ends at the end of platform 2, and of course we have still in existence the 3 sidings on the other side, one that leads up to the station building, and then of course the cattle dock sidings as well. So from here, if we slowly transition into the current day, and this is looking at a satellite view, and you can see it is completely obliterated. There's nothing left of those sidings, the cattle dock sidings, the siding that would have led up to the station building. There's sort of an indication, maybe we can see where the sort of lines or formations where track work might have been. Up beyond the road you can see the dense trees and scrub and bush that's in the cutting where the mainline double track lines used to run, so that was heading into starting to head into a reasonably deep cutting there. And then just to the right of that you can see what appears to be just a farm track running through the paddock there. That would have been the quarry line, so the branch line that went to the quarry, and you can actually see where it would have crossed the road as a level crossing almost directly to the right hand end of the overhead bridge. So now that we've taken a closer look at the surrounding area and geography around the station, and also taken a closer look at the track work and where the track work used to be, the sidings where they used to be, and of course this branch line that went to the quarry. Now coming back to the question that several people asked in the comments in the previous episode about why not model more of the area that's around where the station actually is and what it was like before the line closed. And I was curious to actually do a wee experiment and actually see how the land area, the geography around the current station but before the line was closed, how much would that actually occupy on my station road layout. So we've got an aerial view here of the station road layout, and in particular obviously the station area. You can see down here in the sort of bottom area we've got our mock-up station, we've got the platforms, and of course we've got our pub construction site and so forth in there. So taking this view, and now if we slowly and gradually bring in the satellite view of the current station where it is, you can now actually start to see how much room it would actually occupy on the station road layout. And it's a big area. This is to scale with my layout, so the station building is in the same location, but everything else would disappear. The engine sheds, the track, everything is not right about it. So one of the things that's probably, I guess, the situation here with the model that I'm building for my layout is I'm very much taking the station out of context with where the station is currently in southwest Wales. So the model that's been created for Station Road is really being generated in an entirely new context. So with that investigation and the wee experiment, I turn my attention back to the area I have on the station road layout, and there's two areas either side of the station building. Now, just almost immediately, obviously, to the right hand end of the station building, if you're looking from the street side, of course there is the coals and lamps room, and that does exist at the rail station, and I believe that's what would have been. It's been extended at some point, but of course that will be included as part of both the models. Now, what happens beyond that point, and what happens in the two areas either side of the station? Now, of course, on the left hand side we've got the footbridge, and interestingly, there was a few comments in the previous episode about the footbridge maybe being too close, or maybe it's crowding the station area and so forth. But I have actually moved the station just further along a little bit, so as mentioned, it is now sort of lining up with what would be a T intersection in the road, and that gives a little bit more room around the overhead footbridge. Now, on closer inspection of looking at the footbridge that used to be at the rail station and this Hornby footbridge, I don't think I'm actually going to use the Hornby footbridge, because it's just too out of scale in that sense. The diamond shaped mesh is just far too large. It's kind of a bit ridiculous, so I will be actually scratch building the footbridge as well. So of course also at that end there was a water crane, so that needs to be factored in as well. But what else goes in that area, I'm not too sure. I've marked out some lines on the MDF that sort of indicate where the edge of the platform might be. Now, I might actually make that a bit wider. I think that's a little bit too narrow, so the platform edge will be, or the platform width will be wider. And of course there's also an indication of where the pavement would be on the street side. So at the other end of the station on the right hand side, beyond the coals and lamps rooms, it's a big question as to what goes in that area. So that would have been on the rail station, there would have been a siding that came in and sort of stopped not far from the end of the coals and lamps room. So we know we can't do that, and I'm just trying to figure out what might work in there. So I'm kind of going to put it to my viewers, what do you think would lend itself to this particular area? And of course down at this end also, I've just run a bit of masking tape along the edge of the retaining wall, and of course over the overhead bridge, and that just sort of indicates where pavement will carry on and actually go over the overhead bridge as well. So there we have it for this episode. I kind of feel like maybe I've raised more questions than provided solutions to the area around the station, but we have at least sorted out the overhead bridge and also the factory area, and I think they work out quite well. So I'll leave it there for today's episode. I certainly hope you've gained some insight or inspiration for your own layouts. So do take care. Look after yourselves. Of course, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will catch you next time. Bye for now.